Now, what I'm holding here is a regular model hand. Normally, people would just use this to understand the shape and the lighting that goes into a regular hand. But this is more for artistic purposes, for either like drawing or painting. However, this model hand has a very unique feature. It can actually move by itself. Now, if I can be honest, that hand didn't really come to life. That little clip you just saw was all done in the technique that is simply known as stop motion animation. I'm sure you're all familiar with the two most popular animation mediums, with the classical hand-drawn and the modern computer. But stop motion has always been known to be that other medium, the one that you never see really made famous by those big studios like Disney or Pixar. But now the time has come that we take a good look at the third medium and finally give it the full attention it deserves. Now for this look back, we're going to take a look at some of the more notable stop-motion feature films, while also telling a brief history of some of the biggest names in the medium's history. Now, with that said, it's time for Animation Look Back to present the best of stop motion. Now to start things off, we're gonna go way back to the very beginnings of animation, where we find ourselves in Russia during the start of the Soviet Union. A man decided to take his skills to the ultimate test and turn it into what we know today as the New Gulliver, based on the novel Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, but with a little USSR twist to it. It's about Petya, but his friends call him Gulliver for some reason, who falls asleep while his counselor reads out loud the classic novel by Swift. From there, he dreams that he's in the land of Lilliput, but this time, the land is ruled by an evil and pretty stupid king, who wants to get rid of the newcomer because his ministers convince him that he's a major threat to his power. But with the help of some oppressed workers who wants to make their own revolution, Petya is out to stop the evil tyranny of the king and save the people of Lilliput. Now, if you listened a little carefully to the story, you might have catched the little twist I was talking about earlier. But for those who didn't, really think about it. The main character is helping out a bunch of workers demanding a revolution, or a union of their own, and tries to stop the king that put a monarchy in Lilliput, or in a more modern political way, capitalism. Yep, this is a communist retelling of Gulliver's Travels. Considering that this is made in the early 20th century Russia, that doesn't really surprise me. The production of this began with Alexander Petishko, but I'm just gonna call him Alex because that is much easier to say, who had been working and experimenting on stop-motion projects since 1927. With the combining skills he had developed since, along with a full crew, he decided that he is ready to work on his first feature film that would also be the first feature film with stop-motion puppets, but would also include some live actors in the mix, along with some live-action scenes at both the beginning and the end of the film. In order to get the most expressions out of the puppets, Alex and the crew made a total of 1,500 different puppets, all of which with detachable heads to switch from every frame. In fact, some of the more main characters have around 200 to 300 different heads, each that has a variety of facial expressions. The kid who played Petya, or this movie's Gulliver, was Vladimir Konstantinovich Konstantinov, who was just 15 when the movie was done. He unfortunately died young in World War II in 1944 near Tallinn, Estonia. This would be noted to be his first and only film role he has ever done. When it was released on March 25, 1935, it was a great success and it received major praise. Even the New York Times said that in addition to the technical finesse, the film has genuine wit in its sly assault on the bourgeois institutions. The new Gulliver has been said to be responsible to give rise to some of the big names of what would become the Czechoslovak school of stop-motion animation of the 50s. As for Alex himself, he managed to get a special prize in the International Cinema Festival in Milan, Italy. Afterwards, he and his crew would go on to make more animated shorts between 1936 and 1938, and a new feature film in 1939 called The Golden Key. 2 years later, another stop-motion film came to the scene to put its mark in the history of animation, just like what The New Gulliver did, called The Tale of the Fox, or known by its original title, Le Roman de Renard. Set in the medieval world of talking animals, Reynard is known to be a very clever crook, and everybody kept complaining to the king about the many different ways that he gets away with his crimes. So after the king orders an arrest on Reynard and to be brought before the throne, Reynard has to find a way to outsmart everyone in the kingdom in order to save his life. The movie is based on the classic medieval folktale written by Pierre de Saint Cloud all the way back in 1170. But since then, there had been many different versions and interpretations of the story that came out. The version that this movie is based on in particular is more the 1794 poem by Wolfgang von Goethe. This is noted to be the first and only animated feature to be made by Ladislas Starevich, a Russian animator who moved to France known to make the first ever stop-motion animated film, the 1910's The Beautiful Lucanida. Which might not be as beautiful as you'd think, considering that the puppets used for this are actual dead bugs. All I could think of now is possibly the most horrifying adaptation of James and the Giant Peach.
You enormous bugs!
Fascinating, isn't it?
Anyways, Ladislas actually did a good chunk of the production of this film. Not only was he the director, but also art director, production designer, cinematographer, and one of the writers, all of which he did with his daughter, Irene. The animation was done in an 18-month span between 1929 and 1930. However, there was a huge problem. For some reason, they couldn't seem to add the soundtrack into the film itself. This wouldn't be fixed until 7 years later, when they had enough funding to make a German version by the National Socialist regime. Because of this, there had been many debates from animation fans alike regarding which film can be considered the first ever stop-motion animated feature between The Tale of the Fox and The New Gulliver. On one hand, The New Gulliver came out first in 1935. But it's not all animated. There are a few live-action scenes and live-action actors. On the other hand, though, The Tale of the Fox is the first ever fully stop-motion animated feature, and all of its animation was finished in 1930. But it wouldn't get a release until 1937. I guess I'll let you guys figure out for yourselves which one is considered first. But anyways, if we do go by release dates, this movie would be considered the 6th ever animated feature film, and the 3rd to actually have sound. However, considering that the works of Quirino Cristiani are considered lost, The Tale of the Fox would also be the 3rd oldest surviving animated feature, right behind The New Gulliver and The Adventures of Prince Ahmed. After adding the German soundtrack, the movie was finally released on April 10th, 1937 in Germany, just about 8 months before Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which came out December 21st. Exactly 4 years later, on April 10th, 1941, it was released again, but this time in France, along with a French soundtrack. Today, when you look for the film on DVD or on YouTube, the only version that they're showing is the French one. Moving on to 1949, it was the time that stop motion would find itself with its first movie based on Lewis Carroll's classic, Alice in Wonderland. I'm sure some of you know the story by now. A little British girl named Alice followed a white rabbit down a hole and finds herself in Wonderland, a place that celebrates both the weird and the nonsense. What makes this adaptation stand out more is the fact that this is actually more faithful to the original novel. Some of you may not know this, but Lewis Carroll's novel is actually a bit of a satire of how things were in 19th century England, where many of the characters are based on actual high-ranked people at the time. Some examples include the Queen of Hearts is actually Queen Victoria, the White Rabbit is the Chancellor of Oxford, and the Cheshire Cat is the Dean of Oxford University's Christ College. The way that the movie represents this, that also acts as another thing that makes this adaptation different, is how the movie starts out with some live action scenes that are very similar to the opening of The Wizard of Oz, where you see all the people in Oxford, including Lewis himself, whom would later become their respective characters when the actual story comes into play. The girl who played Alice in the film was English actress Carol Marsh, who was the only live actor in the main story. Everything else in Wonderland was all stop-motion animated by Lou Boonin. It was considered a risky factor when Carol took the part of Alice, since she was 20 years old at the time when the Alice in the book was supposed to be 7. On the other hand, though, Judy Garland was 16 when she did Dorothy, who was a little girl in the original book. So maybe we can consider this another nod to The Wizard of Oz, as odd as it is? Anyways, Carol was so into the part that she even did some of the more dangerous stunts herself, including a 30-foot drop down the rabbit hole. And by the way, no, she wasn't a stunt actress, so there might have been a few minor injuries along the way. When the movie was finished, they made 2 different versions at the same time, an English and a French one since it was made in France. The French one got released first in France in 1949. As for the English version, you'd think it would be out in the UK right afterwards, but they decided not to show it to the British until 1985 because the way the movie caricatures Queen Victoria might be a little offensive. Or in other words, this is most unorthodox. Oh, bloody hell, my monocle. So what the filmmakers did instead is plan to show the English version to the US with a 1951 release date. But there is a big catch to it. Think about it. A 1951 animated film based on the classic novel by Lewis Carroll? Other than this one, does that sound familiar? Ah, there you go. When Walt Disney heard about that Alice in Wonderland coming to the States, he was not happy. At all. In fact, his studio went out to sue the US distributors of that Alice for releasing it so close to Disney's version that was set to be released on July 26, with Time magazine covering the whole trial. Disney asked if they could delay the film about 18 months after theirs so that it wouldn't interfere with its performance at the box office. It didn't work out for Disney, and as a result, both films ended up being a flop. However, Disney was not done yet. Even if it didn't do well in theaters, he tried to make sure that his version would be the one that people will remember the most. And by releasing an edited version of the film for TV, a couple of record albums, and getting re-released in 1974, Walt actually succeeded. Today, his version of the film is amongst the Disney classics alongside films like Snow White and Pinocchio. As for this Alice in Wonderland, it almost fell into obscurity. It tried to air on TV, but even at that, the stations would rather air the 1933 Paramount version, which was another failure when it was released. Jeez, it's like no matter what, if you make a movie based on Alice in Wonderland, it'll pretty much guarantee to fail. That's not a direct adaptation, that doesn't count. Anyways, all hope is not lost to this Alice movie though. Keep in mind, I said almost. Just recently, it was restored by the Museum of Modern Art, which even include 12 extra minutes of never-before-seen footage, and it was shown all across the US at different museums. Interestingly enough, this isn't the only stop-motion Alice in Wonderland film. In 1988, Jan Svankmajer made his first film based on the book that, unlike most adaptations, would act more like a dark dream than a fairy tale, and... Wait, never mind! Forget it! Let's just move on to the next one! Now! good God! What the fritch was that? Anyways, where am I now? Let's get back on track. Oh, this one. Oh, okay. So, moving on to 1954, another stop-motion animated film came into the scene known as Hansel and Gretel, an opera fantasy, based on the opera version of the classic fairy tale by Engelbert Humperdinck. It's the story of two kids named Hansel and Gretel who went out in the woods to get some strawberries by their mother's orders, but ended up lost in the way. Suddenly, they found a house entirely made out of gingerbread, but only to find that it belongs to a nasty kid-eating witch. The puppets that were used in the film were a very special kind, created by Jim Summers, called Kinemans, which is said by producer Michael Meyerberg that it could be controlled electronically. Now, as cool as that sounds, the truth is that the only electronic parts in these Kinemans are just the magnets that are under their feet so they could easily stand on their own in any position. That, and also using knobs to manipulate the faces of the characters instead of just switching heads. That's pretty cool on its own, but still, just when you make my hopes fly high. The place where they made the movie wasn't really in a studio. It was in a former brownstone church on East 2nd Street in New York City near Houston Street, in which the filmmakers took over. However, I highly doubt that the building would still be there as of today. Speaking of the filmmakers, most of the noteworthy people who made this aren't really people who trained in the field of stop motion. Some of the animators hired were actually master puppeteers, including Howdy Doody's Dan Solin and Kermit Love, who would later on work with Jim Henson and create some of the most well-known characters on Sesame Street, including Big Bird, Mr. Snuffleupagus, and more. And no, people, he's not the namesake of this Kermit. Other non-animation people working on this include fashion still photographer Martin Munkaci as director of photography, and even the director John Paul was just a British actor, with this film being his only directing job. Anyways, when they brought in comedic opera diva Anna Russell to do the voice of the witch, they decided to put her likeness onto the puppet. When it was released on October 10th, 1954, it was noted to be the first ever opera animated feature. Not only that, but it was also the first American animated feature film that was not made by Disney since the 1941 Fleischer film Mr. Bug Goes to Town. 4 years later, the movie was sold to TV, and it would air traditionally during the holiday season on several different channels, even at one point on NBC. From there, the film became a cult classic that was released on VHS several times and even on DVD in 2001.
His little coat the color of leaves so brown. Say, who can the creature be? Then